All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thanks for attending. This is Open Forum number 5. In this series of talks, we invite artists from the community to come in and discuss their practice, share their work, their perspectives, and so I guess the fruits of their intellectual labor. Just a quick housekeeping note here. As Robert mentioned in the chat, we will be using the Q&A function for this particular one. So if you have a question at any point during the chat, go ahead and pop it into the Q&A box. You should see the Q&A function down there at the bottom of your Zoom interface, and I'll find a place to weave it in with the conversation with our guest today. My name is Dave Martin. I'm a visual artist. I'm a sculptor and a filmmaker, as well as an educator. I'm also one of the co-founders of Art in Residence. Art in Residence's exhibition space is located on 2.5 acres at the foot of the Antelope Valley Poppy Reserve. The title of our forum today is The Museum is My Medium. And this is of particular interest to us at Art in Residence, as we are an exhibition space that has no walls. We are essentially an empty field that we fill with art whenever we can. So we're really interested in kind of expanded and expansive ideas about exhibitions and about museums in general. Places that aren't necessarily insulated by 4 white walls. Our guest today is Larissa Nickel. She is an artist, designer, educator, and a curator. Her transdisciplinary approach integrates philosophy, art, visual culture, and design to emphasize identity, narrative, place, and subculture. Likewise, her interests as a researcher are multivalent, situated at the intersections of contemporary social and cultural theory, new media, narrative theory, museum studies, architectural and placemaking design, and philosophical issues of memory, aesthetics, educational theory, and database ecosystems. She's also an instructor at Antelope Valley College, so please do pay attention today, as all of this will be on the test. Larissa, welcome to Open Forum.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and excited to kind of explore a lot of our mutual sort of ideas and kind of concepts that we're working here in the Antelope Valley, which really is exciting to see a lot of the fruits of this space as a desert, really kind of growing and building into what is kind of seen as an artistic kind of environment and aspect to our area. So I'm going to go ahead and pop in and share my screen here.
Okay.
Let me know.
Yeah, to start, I think, yeah, what we'll do to kind of ask you to start here, just to frame this for our guests. So as the topic of our session today suggests, right, the museum is my medium. One of the things that Larissa creates is work that addresses the museum as an artistic medium, and not only a space for arts or historical presentation. So yeah, Larissa, what I'd love to start with is an idea of where that interest came from and how it informs your practice. Specifically, what ways can you manipulate the museum that go beyond just simple curatorial practice and actually into artistic practice?
Yeah, it was really great to even kind of start going back to thinking about where that came from and where that sort of idea kind of like generated and initiated in the work. And when I was kind of ruminating on it and thinking about how it kind of developed, it kind of took me back a little bit, because I was thinking about when I first started even thinking about working in a museum. I graduated from a studio art program at UC Santa Barbara, and had was working in design and kind of thinking about commercial sort of art as a place that I was going to go. And when I was thinking about that, it was kind of interesting, because I kind of really felt after leaving, art school, there was sort of this like period of time where it was like, you're stuck in a studio by yourself, and there wasn't that, kind of engaging activity of social space that you have in art school. So I think it really kind of started there when I, first decided that I kind of wanted to think about, where artists go to engage. And I kind of formulated this idea that, I should go work in a museum because that's where art is. And that's where artists are. And I kind of thought of it as sort of a social space where artists could, be involved and kind of like as an artist myself, I could also kind of integrate and work with other artists in that kind of space. So it kind of came to it as thinking through museums as this idea of a social space. Museums to me always were kind of like almost a form of social practice art, and probably even more so in the sense of like social sculpture, where art and life are not separable. They're kind of integrated, and I think it kind of felt like for me that was a really good fit. Like I always kind of had an idea of being an artist in kind of these other spaces. And it really sort of, I tried to be like a museum person and not an artist, because I know that there's, a lot of dialogue around the idea of artists and museums and sort of integrating those two together. But for me, it kind of always felt very comfortable to sort of be an artist working in museum and kind of thinking of it in that way. So it also kind of tied to with, when you're an artist and you get introduced to people, they always ask, what medium do you work in? And you're supposed to say like painting or, something that they understand. And I kind of felt like when I answered, like, I'm, an open opportunity medium person, that it was kind of confusing for people, and they didn't quite know what to make of an artist who would paint and design and sculpt and use new media and kind of go through all those different kind of realms and ways of working. So I kind of, I was thinking about it. I was kind of experiencing, working in a museum, working with artists, and I just came to the conclusion one day that I just needed to be it. I needed to be me, and just like go ahead and make the statement that, what, museum is going to be my medium. And it was a way of kind of processing the concept and the process of working this way. So I sort of kind of thought about containing it a little bit around kind of the museological functions, collection, preservation, interpretation, and display. But leaving room there for kind of artistic sort of innovation in those ideas, not feeling limited that perhaps museum practice has to be as kind of a formulaic kind of design. So I sort of thought of it as kind of a theoretical practice and also a philosophy of art making that allowed me to kind of contain it, kind of bridge it, kind of give it some kind of form, but yet still allow me that kind of creative, innovative kind of quality that I was desiring from an open kind of practice. So it's kind of a way of thinking about art and thinking about how to make things and how to display them and how to kind of memorialize them, how to archive them, and so on and so forth. So these are a few.
I think there you've actually, before we go, I have maybe a couple of questions here that I think what you just said brings up. One is I want to know if there was, as you were thinking about going into the museum, if the gallery system ever occurred to you as an option, or if you had given the sort of same thought about galleries, and ultimately then why sort of choosing the museum as first a venue, and then as it became your sort of your medium, how that's different from a gallery system.
So it was kind of like practical because I was working here in the Antelope Valley, and at the time we had, I think, almost literally one gallery-ish space, which was more of an art collective space. and, one art museum. So, kind of the options here where I was looking were, pretty sparse as far as that goes.
Mhm.
This also kind of coincided with the events of 9/11. So it really sort of was a kind of homecoming for me, um, where, jobs weren't available in where I was looking. I was living in Santa Barbara at the time, and wanting to kind of work, in that area, in that space. So it was kind of partly necessity. There just wasn't, gallery spaces to kind of work in.
Sure.
Arts at the time were also kind of really, being affected by that. It was kind of like, why would you go into art when it wasn't seen as like economically important? Um, there's a whole, bridge of reasoning behind that, but it really was sort of like there was one museum. It was an art museum, and it just kind of played out that um, as I was kind of introspecting on, what happened after 9/11, moving forward in a career, really thinking, do I really want to do commercial art? Do I want to be a part of that kind of process? Or, what is it that I'm really missing in my life? What is it that I'm really wanting out of art? And it was really kind of that social interaction that I felt, especially from the museum and from kind of the way that a museum functions in the social space that a gallery kind of doesn't. So that's
Mhm.
really, kind of a synopsis there of why I didn't really look at the gallery system. I was really looking at museums as kind of that social space.
Okay.
So anyway, these are a couple of
Yeah.
some of the earlier works that I was making as I was thinking through some of the ideas here. Um, I was working at the museum, and also kind of like thinking about the symbols and kind of like the underlying meaning of a museum. And so I was kind of thinking about curiosity cabinets and kind of how museums kind of formulated in earlier forms of museums, kind of the history of museums, um, what was going on with museology as a kind of entity. So I kind of was thinking about, archives, the memory, this, curiosity cabinet kind of perspective, but then also kind of the future, the kind of ways that um, museums can function differently and be, kind of that futurist space. So it also kind of timed out with when I was going into my master's program in museum studies, and I was really thinking about the origins of museums and also, how those kind of mythologies of the museum kind of functions differently than what we think of it now. Now in contemporary times, museums are, quite different than they were, um, at least conceptually, in early forms. We don't necessarily know all that much about these early spaces. We only kind of have that, archaeological record and some of the basic kind of skeleton of what these museums were like, which of course, is great for me as someone who's, an inventor. I like to fill in, some of those elements and kind of ideas. But looking at these, kind of early forms, what really, interested me is that they were literally generative. It wasn't just this, place where you put memory in a box or an object in the back room. It was really intended as kind of this engagement uh, in knowledge and sort of this way of really, you know, instigating new ideas and kind of new spaces that would really, be part of the communities that would grow and kind of, interact and collaborate with people. I also, can just pop these in here too, because um, as kind of an underlying kind of format, there's also this sort of like feminist kind of idea around earlier museums, where it's, less of the Enlightenment kind of form that we're accustomed to, but, looking at, uh, how women as holders of these places sort of had this kind of idea and kind of format for the curiosity, for the knowledge basis, for the kind of social generative sort of idea. That's somewhat, speculation on my part. But obviously, Cleopatra was involved with the Library of Alexandria, and over here we have an early form of museum in Mesopotamia. So that's a kind of undercurrent that sort of drove me into sort of that kind of sort of gendered space and thinking about ideas around gender identification in museums and what that might look like and function as, and kind of drive into sort of this futuristic form. So I brought up here some of the other projects. These are, a little bit more into my ideas on thinking of the museum as a medium. So this one is another kind of symbol that I use quite often, which is based around chess and based around kind of the idea of relationships and how we socially relate to objects, to this idea of the museum, to social space in and of itself. And this is a piece called En Passant, which kind of speaks back to an earlier work that I had made, which is another thing I kind of play with that idea of memory and archive, even including my own sort of archive in the works. And what we're looking at here is kind of this chessboard that's been mounted on the wall. And I thought of it as sort of this way of creating museum vitrines, which are the kind of open pieces that have little mementos and pieces of clothing and thread and other little kind of elements that are of kind of my personal contribution to the work. And then the other is this acrylic mirror that reflects, if there had been a person in this picture, it would have reflected, the viewer who can see themselves kind of be reflected in that space, and also seeing kind of the private, kind of public vitrines that I've created. I also thought about it as kind of interacting in the museum space itself. So it reflects, the other artwork that is in the museum space, and kind of has even its own kind of interaction and own way of kind of creating a relationship in that space where, wherever it goes, it's going to be a little bit different, a little bit of a transition in terms of what it reflects and who it reflects. So that really entices me about this idea of a relational space, looking at the museum as a social kind of structure, and then finding kind of these, sort of ways of encapsulating those ideas and kind of depicting them in kind of an art form. Even if it's not necessarily social practice, it has kind of those elements of socialization and being an interactive and relational kind of entity.
Okay. And is there anything about, because you have the chessboard there, and I know we'll get specifically to games a little bit later, but is there, I don't know, I think just the idea of games seems to me, when I think about, your practice in this context, very, like, that makes a lot of sense as a way to sort of understand some of these ideas as well. Does the chessboard as a game, I mean, to you, how does that kind of fit into your thinking about your practice, or what music is? Is there something sort of metaphorical or allegorical there that we can
It
use?
kind of traces to Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, and she's on the chessboard, kind of learning to navigate relationships and kind of process the difference between reality and nonsense, and kind of exploring life in and it is an allegorical kind of fashion. There's probably also, a direct link to, Duchamp and his um, interest in chess, and also other artists who, have an interest in chess. This idea of kind of like being playing with another person, having that kind of relationship and figuring out a structure between individuals that gaming sort of has. I'm also, I like games, I like fun. There is that kind of element of humor to it as well, where it's a serious subject matter, and but it's kind of relayed in a way that allows people to sort of engage in it, and kind of approach it in a multifaceted kind of way where, yeah, we're talking about a relationship here, but we're going to kind of negotiate um, through the element of wit, through the element of humor, and still sort of see what plays out on that field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, games there's something that's kind of very formal and very predictable about them, but also there's room for spontaneity and for novelty as well. So I think for humans, is we like both. We like to have both things, right? Security, but also novelty. Games are I think fun because we can get a little bit of both.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. So this is kind of a long-term project I've been working on for years. Um, I have an obsession with doilies. It's sort of my admittance in life. It stems from kind of a familial kind of line, matriarchal sort of obsession with, my grandmother and my mother are both not necessarily artists, but incredibly creative, and worked with textiles quite a bit. So I kind of, I don't even know where it's kind of started, but I started collecting these doilies until I had like a ton of doilies. So now I call it the Museum of Doilies, so as a reason to collect these things. But there's a love that I have for these objects as a written archive of, again, feminist craft, technique. And I started thinking about, what can I do with these objects to give them life and to not just have them, in my house, kind of, stacking up. So I started kind of thinking about them as a kind of embodied kind of entrance and exit. And they kind of became sort of this way of entering a different kind of form of museum. This is very, kind of theoretical and conceptual, but, they kind of tie into this idea of the curiosity cabinet as a collective kind of entity and a way to sort of engage that curiosity in the viewer as sort of a kind of, not only through the looking glass, but, kind of moving through that cabinet, moving through that space, and seeing it sort of embodied in these materials that come from an archival kind of realm. This is another project, and these are just kind of all sort of these series that I've developed around musology as a kind of conceptual space. So here in the Antelope Valley, of course, we have this seasonal kind of wildflower bloom, which why that happened. But it also kind of tied into sort of this idea of archiving and collecting these objects, making a space for wildflowers, because typically the poppy is sort of like our state flower and whatnot. But there was also this kind of interest that I had in the other flowers that don't get any play in the world, even though they're quite interesting and quite spectacular. So I started creating, just kind of started documenting from flower kind of vision, this archive of wildflowers as a way of just kind of creating a memory of some of the other entities that are overlooked, but also available in this area and as kind of this, it's this own museum of the environment, of the landscape. And of course, especially with the pandemic that occurred, 2020 was a great wildflower year and also an awesome opportunity to go out walking and to, kind of explore and meander in a way that was, okay to kind of do. So it really, sort of instigated a whole sort of documentation and an archive of the flowers, of specifically, the ones that aren't supposed to be here, that interest me as being kind of overlooked and underappreciated, and also mixing them with a kind of digital space, which is another kind of arena that fascinates me with the world, with this idea of, what happens between digital and physical space. And so these flowers kind of like transition between being, here rendered in digital space, but they existed in physical space and kind of are an archive, are a memory, are a way of documenting that kind of museum idea of the museum as landscape, the museum environment. So this is another project. This is a work that I did for Rockhaven Sanatorium, which kind of was an interesting project to get involved in, mainly because at this time and I still believe they're still kind of trying to work this facility into a museum space. But it's a unique kind of place of absence, again, of kind of, a heterotopian space where, it's not really intended to kind of be either, a good space or a bad space. It's kind of this other space that I find really, fascinating, and really kind of speaks to that idea of subculture, this idea of the other kind of space that we don't look at, that we don't really address or want to kind of negotiate. So it was kind of a research project at first, where we were invited in to kind of look through and kind of experience the space. And I was just really captivated by the design and the interior design in particular. I mean, the colors in this place are insane. It's just like every room is so thoughtful and so like created and designed in terms of like decoration. And I just kind of was fascinated by that and thought about, kind of bringing that element out and thinking of, if this building in this place didn't turn into a museum and it did get raised and, a hotel put on top of it, there wouldn't be that record, that archive of what, had been kind of part of that space. And I was also really interested, I was looking at this space as kind of like, in reference to the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which, kind of creates a sort of underlying, kind of insecurity about the wallpaper and what it stands for. So I wanted to kind of like use this interference paint that sort of like took the wallpaper from being literally, exact what the wallpaper looked like, and sort of shifted it in a subtle kind of way. So when you walked around the works, and they were installed here, actually, in Rockhaven as part of an event, so that you could walk through the rooms and kind of experience, the design of the paintings in the actual space. But they also differed, so that was kind of like, it was an uncanny kind of way of looking at that work and kind of seeing it, not necessarily as the literal kind of form of an archive and exactitude of it, but as kind of a play on how that space feels and what kind of experience you can have in an actual site.
Mhm.
So this is another project, Hinterculture, which is what I consider the deserted museum. So I wanted to kind of think about the space of the Antelope Valley as kind of a non-site. Well, what if the museum didn't have walls, didn't have architecture, was just part of the actual landscape of kind of the space around it. And there's, so many great stories from the Antelope Valley that are kind of overlooked and not often, kind of discussed. There's Tropico up here, of course, Llano, and then also, all the other kind of elements of the people, Poncho Barnes, for example, Captain Beefheart, the Cactus Curtain. There's a lot of elements of fun that the Antelope Valley has in terms of history that isn't so like regulated and isn't so like serious. That also kind of fascinated me about the space around us, the desert itself, and kind of what kind of things we explore in the desert here. And that kind of led into desert, which I think of as kind of the discarded museum, this idea of value that we have for not only spaces, but also objects. And thinking about, this idea of the landscape and what we discard and what we think about as a wasteland. That was kind of really interesting to me, and also thinking about ideas about what matters and what does it mean to have an ecology of mattering. What is that? What does that look like? And why don't we care about the earth and some of these ecological components that we pass by every day and just kind of say, well, clean it up, put it somewhere else. It doesn't really go anywhere. It just kind of exists in the world no matter what we kind of think about these objects. So that led me to Yestermorrow. And Yestermorrow is kind of a broader way of looking at some of these earlier ideas, where I was, kind of thinking about the museum as and kind of exploring some of the practical projects of the museum. And I wanted to kind of look at this idea of how we go about creating sort of a speculative platform for the past, present, and the future. And thinking about, can that be a way to readdress some of the things that has happened in culture, some of the things that we've forgotten, some of the things that we need to kind of deal with and explore. I also thought of it as kind of like a feminist kind of approach to looking again at kind of this, gender identification of the human and how museums, still have that kind of masculine version of humanity. Human is part of kind of that process. So I was kind of thinking about, what would happen if I shifted it into sort of a feminist vision of that, and still connected it to, both the history and also, this idea of memory and kind of inclusivity in the archive and in that kind of participatory practice. So it kind of tied into this other way that I was thinking, of can you experience a place without going there? Do you have to physically be there, or are there ways to kind of physically connect to a space without necessarily having to, be there in person? Because of some of the things that I was looking at with culture and desert and some of these other projects around the Antelope Valley, tourism was kind of weighing on me, and this idea of, should we be bringing people here, or will that, kind of have a negative effect? What's the role of tourism in a social space? So I was kind of tossing some of those ideas around and thinking about, okay, well, if you don't have to be here, like what would it kind of look like? So that kind of took me back to when I was in my master's program. We were working on a project built around this idea of third space. which it's kind of funny now because we're so totally in third space zone with the pandemic, but it was this idea of exploring a kind of hybrid experience of place where, what you're seeing over here is there was groups of us that were in person in an actual museum. And then there were groups of us who were online, and it could have been theoretically, is intended to be, any person who wanted to kind of experience that museum. So they were kind of connected through mobile phones and kind of being able to, talk via Twitter and connect, instantaneously with those of us in person, so we could have the sort of like back and forth experience of place. So I was kind of thinking about this and thinking about this project and what we were kind of exploring with museums at this time, this, kind of way, this other way of experiencing museums, this other way of using technology to connect and to, be in person, but not there, and to explore that through kind of this sensory experience. I was really interested in wind and sound and kind of some of those elements that I was working with during this project. And that also connected me to another kind of interest of mine, which is archigram here. And archigram was working in the 60s and really became kind of this group that, they kind of predated like internet ideas. They came up with, these two projects here that I'm showing are from Instant City, which, totally ties into a lot of the concepts here with this hybrid space where basically, their concept was that they would load up this Zephyr over here with all this kind of cultural content, video feeds and lectures and books and material and whatnot. And they would fly it over an area that didn't have like, a huge cultural kind of sphere. So rural areas, places that had, a lack of access to arts and technology. So then they would unleash all of this material, kind of let people experience it. But they were also really forward thinking and going back to kind of that early museum kind of origin. It wasn't just like a project where they would like drop it off and then leave. They would also collect information from the actual space, from the rural areas, and load it back up to the balloon so that the people in those places could also participate and generate educational information, cultural information, artistic information. It would then go to another location, and that would also kind of be shared. So it was a really, kind of like a mobile version of like early museums that I just love. And I love these projects and think about them, all the time, this idea of architecture, outside of architecture with balloons and kind of these really engaging kind of forms that they were using to explore generating material and generating educational content.
Yeah, there's a very idealistic or utopian kind of an idea to that one of traveling and going to bringing just cultural content to a space and then just taking what's given and then moving on to another. But of course, as we know, all too often in human society and recently often, sometimes moving into another space is not always as collaborative and as cooperative an idea as is there. And I know that utopia is also something that you do kind of think about quite a bit in your work and maybe thinking around sort of some of these ideas about the museum. Is that right?
Yeah, and I've kind of gone into thinking about sort of heterotopian space. Like that's sort of the element of this idea about the mirror being reflective. The museum is considered, a heterotopian space. So it's sort of like,
What do you mean by yeah, heterotopia?
beyond,
Yeah. What do you mean by
outside
that
of
word?
like utopia and dystopia, it's like good and bad. But then there's this
Mm-hmm.
other place. There's this, other kind of entity that doesn't get kind of encapsulated by those other two terms, because utopia, it's a super loaded term, it doesn't exist and so on and so forth. Dystopia is obviously terrible. Nobody wants to be there and be a part of that. So it kind of like bridges a little bit, I guess. It's an incredibly philosophical term, but I feel like it really connects to me as, deserts are considered heterotopian, museums are considered heterotopian, mirrors are considered heterotopian. So there's this really fertile kind of place of thinking about them outside of just being deemed, either good or bad. Where is that other space? Where is that kind of like third space, that alternative to being, conditioned into that kind of, good and bad kind of divide. So that's why it always kind of really, I get called utopian a lot. And I probably am. It's sort of a natural kind of like, it's great, it's gonna be awesome. But I really kind of feel like as it gets into the complexity of it, that kind of other space is really where I'm driven and really where I look. And that's, it's integrated into that conversation of utopian and dystopian, but also still shifting into an other space. So moving into some of the practical elements, speaking of kind of like, archigram looking at rural places, the county was also starting to look at rural places and thinking about access, in these areas of the Antelope Valley that doesn't have either museums or gallery spaces or even, just activities for arts interaction. So they had me create this interview and survey where I documented some of the aspects of what people were looking for in the Antelope Valley as art, and kind of asking, directly, what is it that you want? What is it that we need? And what can we do with, the Antelope Valley as sort of an art space? Like, where can we go with that art space? So one of the things that came up was the idea that people wanted, it to be art forward. They really wanted artists to drive the content. And they also really wanted to focus on kind of the historical elements, the heritage of the Antelope Valley. There was this idea that, outsiders coming in might suppress that kind of heritage. They may not, necessarily understand some of the history of the Antelope Valley itself. So I got the opportunity to craft this project with Yestermorrow specifically for Llano, California, which is a rural area of the Antelope Valley, but also one that has an incredible history of artistic interaction. So showing here, just some connections from the Llano del Rio colony with their interest and desire to support art and to engage artists in that space. There's also a huge archive that I've been working on, trying to develop of artists throughout, all kinds of time. Of course, David Hockney is probably the most famous, but there's all kinds of artworks that have been created around Llano and about Llano and in Llano. So I've been kind of trying to build this archive and collection of Llano forms of art and to kind of document a little bit of that. It's also, of course, a historical space for numerous reasons. This is obviously the most talked about, which is the Llano del Rio Cooperative Colony, which is this, again, we'll use the word utopian, socialist colony that came here and kind of started building their, ideas of life and trying how they thought about living and thinking. It's also a historical landmark that makes it kind of an important element of not only Antelope Valley history, but also of Los Angeles's history as well, since there's so many stories connected between Yano and Los Angeles. So it was really kind of thinking about some of the ideas that we'd covered already, this idea of the desert as being sort of this, non-place, but it has this incredible, rich, narrative and story to it. And thinking about how to kind of frame projects around, respecting the rural quality of place, but also then thinking about its future and what could, happen, in moving forward and thinking about what would happen to this place in kind of that future sort of narrative. So that brought about Mr. Mariano, an artist field guide to Llano, California. And this is, I'm just showing a few elements of the actual guide itself that I created, which is available online if you're interested in order to kind of explore it a little bit further. But I was thinking about it in terms of crafting a guide to, feminist geography, thinking about, what an embodied place would look like. How could we connect to this place through sensory experience in particular? Not just, having a book and reading about it, but really thinking about, what we could do to connect as a participatory kind of place, and connect to that history.
Smells and yeah, smells and tastes. I know there are there's a section of recipes in the book as well.
It sure is.
My particular favorite, and this will just maybe be to get people to go and check out the book for themselves. But I'm a big fan of the Utopia. Actually, I think that particular recipe that you have in there.
Yes, that's
it's quite a good one. Okay, well, yeah, I think this is maybe a good place to see if there are any questions. There are a couple of things that occurred to me that I want to ask about here as we close it up. But I like, this particular project of Yes Tomorrow as kind of an embodiment of at least one of these ideas about museums that you had. So we talked about a couple of different things of the museum as landscape, sort of the museum as game, as this kind of third space that can be traveling or sort of interact with its subject matter at a distance. But I think what I want to ask, yeah, like I said, two questions here. One, what do you think is the relationship and or the responsibility of the museum, kind of as a as a larger, or just take that word as you will, to its subject matter, kind of to its content or to what it is displaying?
I think it's difficult because I think one thing that we do in reference to museums is we kind of think of them as a singular entity. But if you look at museums, they're all really wildly different. I mean, just look at LACMA versus the Getty. I mean, they're two completely different entities. And we also have that there's science museums and there's history museums. So I think it's really difficult, and I think it's problematic that we kind of look at museums in a singular sort of way and not really seeing them as what I'm trying to kind of promote as exploratory, as experimental, as socially reflective, participatory places in the world, and they don't all have to kind of like fit into this nice little mold that we kind of have sort of driven them to. And I feel like in some ways that's a social component of how we've thought about museums and how they've also been formulated. I feel like if they were more open to being experimental, there would be a different kind of version of them. So I feel like we've started to see museums kind of become a little bit of a different entity that's not necessarily as socially generative as it could be and should be. I'll say that I feel that way. Um, where it's more of a top down rather than a bottom up kind of exploration of what they are there to do. Um, I'm kind of curious to see what's going to happen. The pandemic really is kind of creating a sort of way of kind of coming to that space and really exploring that space in a different way.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if it's going to happen or not, but I think that there is a kind of responsibility, and I think museums are being held in sort of a reckoning at this point, where people are unhappy with how they've been represented, or how museums have functioned in the social sphere. Um, but it's going to require a huge, kind of adaptive evolution of, and at least in my opinion, of thinking back to what museums really started as, and kind of moving away from the Enlightenment kind of structure that museums have been developing and creating throughout that kind of portion of time.
Mhm. Right. So the museum as a space where knowledge is generated, right, and not necessarily just housed or stored.
Correct. And not just that
Is that about
70
right?
that we think of too. That's always another thing where objects go to die, and to
Hmm.
kind of be hidden away from people. And that's really not what museums are about. That's really not how they initiated. um, it's kind of another way of containing that knowledge of thinking about this reasoning entity that controls and classifies and creates the space for that object. And the way that we think about objects is kind of changing and shifting. And for me, it ties into that kind of new materialist space where we're starting to see beyond the human, beyond the species even, and our connection with the world around us as being more integrated and more of an ecosystem that way.
Hmm. Right. And then we could get into the post-human museum, but I think that might be its own separate open forum. Well, just on
Another
that one.
hour or two.
Uh-huh. At least. Well, maybe then, I mean, just in the last couple of minutes here, and again, if for all of our audience members, if there are any questions, please do put them, go and put those in the Q&A, and we'll get to those. Otherwise, we can close with this one. Back at the beginning, you said that one of your kind of reasons for getting into the museum and museum studies was the idea of them as a social space, as a way for you to get out of your studio and kind of get into the world and work, in conjunction with other artists, obviously with the county for some of these projects. Have you found that's held true and that's been successful? And are there any examples of some great collaborations or some folks that you've worked with that you've really enjoyed in that idea of kind of exploring the museum as a social space?
Well, I mean, I really loved it when I worked at a museum and had that kind of feeling of collaboration. Um, it kind of has that, kind of space of trying to find the right kind of collaboration. Um, I think it's difficult, and I'm thinking a little bit in terms of like Fred Wilson and how he um, has been able to sort of create a career that embraces museums, embraces that collectivity, embraces those ideas, but still allows him to kind of create as an artist. And I think kind of that institutional critique, but moving beyond that as an institutional shifter, if that makes any sense, um, is
Mhm.
really what entices me about that. And I think I've kind of struggled a little bit of knowing, when you work in a museum, you work in a museum, you're there as a an art worker. There's also space for kind of that collaboration, but there's also, I've found, to kind of have the empowerment of not working in a museum, but working with museums, and kind of finding a kind of space of that power as being seen as an artist, and not necessarily as the employee. But I feel like there is still kind of that shift, and kind of way of moving back and forth between the two, that I find really enticing. Like, there is kind of that feeling of learning from a museum as an art worker, but also then being able to take that and explore it independently or collaboratively, or in a way that kind of detaches it, kind of turns it into that heterotopian space, where you're kind of outside but inside, but kind of connected but not, required. That I really find that kind of subcultural, sort of outer kind of connected space to be really, really where I find myself, like the best kind of version of it, if that makes any sense. Does that answer your question?
Okay, yeah, I think so. And also there was a question in the chat, which was, I think, very similar. Was asking about how you approach collaborations, mentioning that the projects you've shown reveal traces of social space, but people are mostly absent, and at least in the images that we've seen here. Is that a conscious choice? Is that just a result of the way that you work, or are we just seeing a small sample here, and there are images of people?
Yeah, there's plenty of images of
otherwhere.
people integrating. So, it's always a decision. You have to kind of figure out, like, what kind of brings forth the ideas in the best fashion. So there are, I could have put in, definitely pictures with people interacting. I think I was kind of thinking about this as kind of formulating some of the ideas towards another project. We didn't quite get to it, but some of the ideas that have kind of constructed around some of these social projects. And I'm speaking specifically of the Recumbent Museum that I've been kind of working on. And these are kind of like sub projects of sort of that larger scope. So there's kind of this idea of kind of working into a way that it's about sharing participatory experiences in, and I won't go too far into it because I'll get a little crazy here, but into a whole other sphere of social kind of space, which would literally be kind of like our shared DNA, kind of a whole other sci-fi kind of version of how we interact socially and how we collaborate, not necessarily in the present, but in kind of this futurist space. So I did kind of like craft this sort of PowerPoint towards that kind of approach, but there's definitely, a whole kind of sphere of collaboration and thinking about how people interact and kind of connect, not just, with myself, but it ties back to that idea of the chessboard, and this, there is kind of this personal experience of sharing, and then there is also this collective way of sharing, and I'm really interested in the back and forth between, how an individual connects but still is an individual in their sphere, and how that kind of shift occurs, kind of growing into thinking about how to dissolve that kind of I don't know if I would want to say boundary, but kind of space into a kind of new form of connecting. So it's not just for me about kind of the present way that we connect, in a public space or something like that, but also thinking conceptually about how that in the future might look, and what those relationships are really kind of back and forth about. Is maybe it is really just a whole game of chess that we're all playing, sharing our personal stories and then collecting socially in that space.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Larissa, I want to thank you very much for joining us for Open Forum number 5 today. I don't see any other questions here. And thanks to everyone who attended as well. We do these every 2 months, so if you're not on our social media sites, you can follow us at art_in_residence. Thanks so much to Robert for hosting and kind of running the tech on this one. Always special thanks to Nathaniel, my co-founder at Art in Residence, and the CIC. Robin is here. Robin and Robert also board members, and they're not here, but also thanks and recognitions to Janice On, our third co-founder here. So with that, we'll bring Open Forum number 5 here to a close. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and Larissa, thanks again for joining us and sharing your work with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.